NBA Moneyball. I'm Jackson Cloud.
And I'm Alex Ambite.
So our main reason for doing this project was inspired by the movie Moneyball, which came out in 2011, about the 2002 A's season. Despite being one of the poorest teams in all of the MLB, they were really successful by identifying really low salary but high impact players. So they had a really small budget, but they couldn't afford superstars. So they had a really depth roster, and they ended up being really successful. We wanted to see if this approach would work toward the NBA. So we asked specifically, do teams that invest heavily in a few top players perform better than those that spread their budget more evenly across the entire roster? So in order to do this, we did two metrics, one for measuring success and one for how teams really allocated their budget across all of their salaries. So for overall success, we looked at a couple different things. We looked at standings potentially being one, postseason success. What we found the most success is using overall wins, so we just went with that. And then for how teams allocated their salary, we came up with something called the star concentration. Rather than doing something like standard deviation or number of outliers, we found that this just yielded the best results. This would just take the overall salary of their top three players. So for this season, this was the 2022 Lakers as an example. We would take the salaries of the top three players, LeBron, AD, and Dennis Schroeder, and then use that as a percentage of their total salary across all of their roster. And then we call that a star concentration.
Yeah, so to gather this data, we needed to get the success data and we needed to get the salary data. To get the success data, we used Basketball Reference, and that was fairly easy. We just copy and pasted the data. They had a ton of standings from 2011 until 2024, which was our data set. And then SpoTrack, which is what we used to get the salary data, which was a bit more difficult because they wouldn't let us just copy and paste the data. And even if we wanted to, there was over 10,000 values from over 300 links. So what we decided to do was take advantage of HTML data, which is how websites are created. We used a Python library called Beautiful Soup to scrape this data. And what it would do is it would find, if you can see there in green, it says table, it would find every table, and then from there, go through each table row, which corresponded with each player. And from there, we would get the player name and the player's salary. And when we plotted this, we found that there was no correlation. No matter how much you spent on your top three players or how little you spent on your top three players in comparison to the rest, there was no correlation between the amount of wins that you got. And this was very interesting because, as we'll see later, we compared this to wealth, and you'll see the differences between how that ends up. But as you can see here, we split every team into three categories. The top 25% in terms of star concentration were considered super teams. So these were teams that would spend 60% or 65% or more of their salary on their top three players. And we had Moneyball teams, which were teams in the lowest 25%, which means that these guys spent a very spread out approach. These guys didn't spend very much on their top three players. And as you can see, if anything, the super team strategy was a bit more effective than the Moneyball strategy, but there was a lot of variance, meaning this isn't a very good metric. If you want to see how this looks throughout the years, you can see in the earlier years, the super team strategy was by far the best. Having a few superstar players was the best approach to get more wins. And then as we went throughout the years, there didn't really seem to be a good strategy. And then starting here in 2019 up until now, it seems the super team strategy has been sort of pulling away more.
So if the way teams allocate their salaries isn't a really good way to see how many wins they're going to have, what is a really good metric? Well, that's wealth. When we split teams, not by how they allocated their wealth, but instead just how much they had towards player salaries in total, we saw that there was a huge contrast between the poor teams and the wealthy teams. So the wealthy teams were the teams that were in the top 25th percentile of over salaries combined throughout the entire roster. Middle class was middle 50 percentile, and then poor was the bottom 25 percentile. And as you can see, the wealthy teams won on average 18 more games per season than the poor teams, which is pretty crazy. I just want to highlight this outlier up here. That's the 2015-16 Warriors, who set the record for overall wins at 73. If you look at our past slide, it would seem to show that they're a Moneyball team. So you might, in their outline, that's that dot way up there. So you might think like, oh, they didn't really spend a lot of money toward their top three players. That might be a reason for their success. But I think that when you really contextualize it here, you'll see that they actually were successful just because they had one of the biggest budgets in the entire NBA that season. Not really how they allocated it. This is the same graph as before. Also, this is sorted by different wealths. And as you can see, there's not really a strong correlation between how wealthy a team was and what strategy they chose to go with. However, you can see that the wealthier teams, the blue, tend to be above the red teams, who tend to be above the green teams. So you definitely want to have more money if you can. And then this kind of shows the same thing, but contextualized a little bit differently. This shows the star concentration against how wealthy they are. So again, how wealthy they are doesn't really project how they're going to spend their money. If anything, wealthy teams tend to spend a little bit more on average on their top players as a percentage. But it's not a super good comparison. As you can see, there's a pretty big range. So yeah.
So the key takeaway, if you didn't listen to any of our presentation, this is what you need to know, is that it does not matter how these teams allocate their money towards their players. What matters is how much money they have overall.
Yeah, so going forward, this begs the question, is the NBA becoming progressively more pay to win?
It also, if certain front offices consistently overperform their payroll spending, what are they doing differently? Are they using budget towards their coaching staff or their facilities? Or are they deciding to spend on specific players rather than doing Moneyball strategies?
And then finally, will the NBA take action toward leveling the playing field towards richer teams?
All right.
Well,
Thank you.